So welcome to Wine and Wisdom for this week, Parshat Shelach. An interesting Parsha this week. We'll do the Parsha overview in just a minute. And the title for today's class is The Imperative to Reach Out and Help Another. Can we sacrifice morals to help another? It's going to be part Talmudic analysis and part strong lesson and strong takeaway for each of us. So I can't wait for this journey together with all of you.
But in the second half, is going to be a tongue lashing or what?
Not a tongue lashing, but we're going to study and we're going to take it to heart.
Oh, okay. Just clarifying.
All right. But we will get started with an overview of the Parsha. And Arnold, once you're unmuted, if I can ask you to read, please, Parshat Shelach. What's it all about? Go for it.
Okay. I'm still muted?
Oh, no, you're good.
Okay. Moses sends 12 spies to the land of Canaan. 40 days later, they return carrying a huge chest of grapes, of pomegranates, and of fig to report on a lush and beautiful land. But 10 of the spies warned that the inhabitants of the land are giants and warriors, more powerful than we. Only Caleb and Joshua insisted that the land can be conquered as God had commanded. The people were weak. The people weep that they rather return to Egypt. God decrees that Israel enter into the land shall be delayed 40 years, during which time that entire generation will die out in the desert. A group of remorseful Jews. I'm sorry, but my glasses are.
That's okay. You're good.
I didn't clean them, and so okay. A group of remorseful Jews stormed the mountain on the border of the land and are routed by the Amalekites and the Canaanites. The laws of the menachot, meal, wine, and oil offerings are given, as well as the mitzvah to consecrate a portion of the dough, the challah, to God when making bread. A man violated the Sabbath by gathering sticks and is put to death. God instructs us to place the fringes, tzitzits, on the four corners of the garments, so that we should remember to find that to fulfill the mitzvah divine commandments.
All right. So lots going on in this week's Parsha. Some things that we're very, very familiar with, such as the mitzvah of tzitzit. That's actually one of the paragraphs that we say when we say the Shema every single day, twice daily. And if you're following all the customs, then you're saying it a good 4 times daily. In the Shema, the final paragraph is Vayomer when we read about the tzitzit, and that's when we kiss our tzitzit each time. So that's in this week's Parsha. We also have the mitzvah of challah. If you've ever been to a challah bake here at Challah Pasadena, inspired by this week's Parsha, was the mitzvah of challah, the mitzvah of taking a portion of the dough when you make challah and consecrating that, making that holy for Hashem. That's in this week's Parsha. Some sacrificial laws, and yeah, very, very exciting. But the highlight of this week's Parsha is, without a doubt, the story of the Miraglim, the story of the messengers, the spies, the scouts that were sent by Moshe Rabbeinu and the Jewish people to scout out the land of Israel to see what's going on. And we're going to start off by diving right into that story. But in order to set the tone for the lesson that we're going to learn at the end, allow me to start off by asking this question. We all know that chesed or tzedakah, in other words, kindness and charity, these are central pillars of Judaism, right? Caring for another person. Years before John F. Kennedy took office, Jewish children at the age of 5 were saying, ask not what others can do for you, but ask what you can do for others, right? And we've been doing this for years and years. Chesed is a pillar. We all know this. Kindness and caring for other people. It's what Judaism is all about. We can go all the way back if we want. I mean, there's so many stories that illustrate this, but probably the most poignant is Hillel. When a man comes and he wants to convert to Judaism, he tells Hillel, I want to study the entire Torah while standing on one foot. Well, first he comes to Shammai, and Shammai throws him away, but then he comes to Hillel, and Hillel says, what is hateful, what is what you don't want done to you,
don't do to others.
Don't do unto others. And that's the cardinal, and that's the entire Torah. And he said, that's the whole thing? So I said, yeah, that's the whole thing. But the rest of it is explanation. And now you have to go and study the rest of it. I spend the rest of your life studying the rest of it and seeing how the whole world comes to that part. But today, I'd like to discuss when that gets a little bit more nuanced, or when that gets a little bit more complicated. Okay, so all of you right now would say, it's easy for me to give up of my physical comfort for the physical comfort of another, right? Which is typical charity. I have, I don't know, $10,000 in the bank account, and I say, listen, I need X amount to pay rent, whatever this is my budget, I have an extra $300, and I'm going to give $350, $50 eating into my own. I'm going to survive on less in order that someone else should be able to live. Great, we're all familiar with that, right? I right now want to go wherever, but I know that someone needs my help. And all I want to do is relax on the couch, but I know that I have a friend who just has, I don't know, something that happened in their lives. I'm going to make dinner and bring it over to their house. All the classic examples of kindness to other people involve when we sacrifice a little bit of our material life in order to give materialism to the other person, in order to help the other person physically. When it comes to spirituality, things start to get a little more iffy. What's about, where do things stand morally? If I'm going to sacrifice a little bit of my own spirituality, or sacrifice a little bit of my religiousness for someone else, and that gets a lot more iffy, because that's not just being a little more uncomfortable. That's letting go of some of your spirituality. That's much deeper. So today we're going to try to shed some light on that, and to understand. It definitely gets a little nitty gritty, in which cases it's allowed, in which cases it's not allowed, what's at stake here, what are you putting at stake, etc. And hopefully we'll walk out with a little more clarity and a little more inspiration on what exactly it means to help another person that way. Okay? And we're going to learn about this from the story of the spies. So in case your memory is a little fuzzy, we're gonna do it. Hopefully we'll do it a little quicker than so again, the question on the table is sacrificing religious adherence to help someone admirable, or is that a bad idea? So Phil, if I can ask you to, I just muted you, I'm sorry. If I can ask you to get us started at text 1a, which is from this week's Parsha. The Jewish people are about to go into the land of Israel, and Moses sends spies, he sends scouts. Go ahead.
God said to Moses, saying, send out for yourselves men who will scout the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the children of Israel. You shall send one man each father's tribe. Each one shall be a chieftain in their midst. So Moses sent them from the desert of Paran by the word of God. All of them were men of distinction. They were the heads of the children of Israel.
So Moses finds some of the best, the cream of the crop. He wants people that are going to represent the Jewish people in the land of Israel. They're going to go there and they're going to scout out. They're going to come back with a report of positivity. They're going to see the spirituality of the land. And they're going to come back and tell the people about this. But unfortunately, the whole mission lands on its head, as we know. Phil, if you can continue, please. Text 1b, when the spies come back.
They returned from scouting the land at the end of 40 days. They went and they came to Moses and Aaron and all the congregation of the children of Israel in the desert of Paran to Kadesh. They brought them back a report, as well as the entire congregation, and they showed them the fruit of the land. They told them and said, we came to the land which you sent us, and it is flowing with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. However, the people who inhabit the land are many, and the cities are extremely huge and fortified. And there we saw the offspring of the giants.
Hey, keep going.
The Amalekites dwell in the southland, while the Hittites, the Jebusites, and the Amorites dwell in the mountainous region. The Canaanites dwell on the coast and alongside the Jordan. Caleb silenced the people to hear from Moses, and he said, we can surely go up and take possession of it, for we can indeed overcome it. But the men who went up with him said, we are unable to go up against the people, for they are stronger than us. They spread an evil report about the land that they had scouted, telling the children of Israel, the land we passed through to explore is a land that consumes its inhabitants, and all the people we saw in it are men of stature.
So this is a very interesting story. They come back, and as it's often classified, they speak lashon hara about the land. They speak evil speech about the land. All they should be telling the Jewish people is have faith. These are spiritual leaders. Have faith. God is going to fight the war for us. We're going to conquer the land, and we're going to come to the land of Israel, and it's so spiritual, and it's going to be holy, etc. Right? Instead, they come and they have all these negative things to say. With the exception of two of them, of course, Joshua and Caleb, Yehoshua and Caleb, who attempt to sway the narrative and make it more of a positive report, but they do not have success. And as the story goes, this leads to a rebellion among the people. They scream at Moses and they say, "You brought us out here to die in the desert. We would rather died in Egypt. At least we should have stayed in Egypt. We would have been better off there, even as slaves. At least we wouldn't have been dying in the middle of nowhere or died in war while trying to conquer a land." Oh, rebellion! And as a result of this rebellion, Hashem decrees that this is not the nation that He wants to enter the land of Israel. Their faith is too weak. And He decrees that the Jewish people should be 40 years in the desert, and during that time, every single member of that generation would die out, with the exclusion of Joshua and Caleb, Joshua and Caleb. They will be the only two people that will enter the land of Israel. It will be an entirely new generation, which is brought up in a lifestyle of faith and believing in God, not just a lifestyle of faith, by the way, meaning practical faith. They literally, for their entire sustenance, for their food and their clothing and their protection, they relied on God. Remember, 40 years in the desert, that was the only way they survived. And these people will be the new generation which will go into the land of Israel. Very interesting. Now, Rashi explains that throughout their journey, the spies saw various different things. And you see this reflected in their little speech that they give when they come back, which we read some of, thank you, Phil. But really, there's more to it. And the spies kind of interpreted each step of the way, which could have been interpreted positively. They chose to interpret it negatively. Ron, can I ask you to read for us Rashi? Text 2a. Let me just bring it up here. This is, of course, this 2a. Go for it.
They carried it on a pole between two people.
So hold on. We didn't read this in the text, but this is a reference to the fact that when they came, they brought the fruits of the land with them, and they saw them and they were tremendous in size. Okay? And Rashi points out that, go ahead.
They carried it on a pole between two people. From the implication of they carried it on a pole, do I not know that it was carried by two? So what does between two tell us? The answer is with two poles. How was it done? 8 of them took a cluster of grapes, 1 took a fig, and 1 took a pomegranate. Joshua and Caleb did not take anything, for the intention of the others was to present a slanderous report, namely, just as its fruit is strange, so its people are strange.
So Hashem, hold on, Ron, we're going to have you read the next Rashi as well. So Hashem shows them these amazing, amazing fruits, hoping to show them what an amazing land this is, and they interpret this as the fruit are strange. It must be that the inhabitants are also strange, and do we really want to live in this land? Okay, that's one example. A second example, text 2b, is another Rashi, which this is a verse which we did quote, which is Eretz ochelet et yoshveha. It is a land that consumes its inhabitants. Where do they get this idea from? The land itself, it consumes its inhabitants. What does that mean? Go ahead, Ron.
Consumes its inhabitants. Wherever we pass, we found them burying dead. The Holy One, blessed is He, intended this for good, to keep them occupied with their mourning, so they should not notice them, the spies.
So again, Hashem did for them a tremendous miracle. Right? Hashem performed a miracle for them that instead of them coming, and this was the way of the world at those times, if anybody's going to wage war with you, especially a big nation that's traveling through the desert, so they're going to send spies. They're on the lookout for spies all the time. But it happened to be that day there was a big epidemic or pandemic. I don't know. Maybe they didn't have differences between the two in those days. And a whole bunch of people died. A whole bunch of Canaanites died. And so the Jewish people, the Jewish spies, went unnoticed because they were busy with the funerals. But how do they interpret this miracle? Instead of looking at it as a miracle, as always, we get two choices. And we get a choice of which way we want to see things. And they interpret this as Eretz ochelet et yoshveha. It's a land that consumes its people. In other words, there's something wrong with the land. Everybody dies there and gets buried there. So it turns out that the mission itself could have been a success. There was nothing entirely wrong. I mean, there's a lot of commentary about this, whether it was wrong or not to send spies. Maybe the faith should have been that we didn't even need spies. Either way, leaving that aside. But certainly once the spies went, it seems that the big issue was the Lashon Hara. In other words, the way that they spun the narrative. As we all know, politicians, or really anyone in power, have a tremendous responsibility in the way that they present even the most clear facts. Right? You could present exactly the same facts. There's so many examples of this. You could look at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, right? And if you look at politicians who want to be pro-Israel, they know how to spin the entire thing, that everything is amazing for Israel, and Israel's doing everything amazing, etc. If you look at somebody who's pro-Palestinian, somehow all the same things become pro-Palestinian. You know how to spin it, right? Now there are some who tell blatant lies. But hopefully, if everybody's saying the facts and they're saying the truth, right? They're just choosing which things to say and which things not to say and how to present things, right? And with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, this happens all the time, as we know. If you even watch even a drop in news, you see that. But really, it's with everything, right? Any leader, any person who's leading the way has a choice what way they're going to spin the facts. Is it going to be positive or is it going to be negative, right? Every coach knows this. Every general or commander in the army knows this. The morale of your people depends on how you process the information that's going on. And the issue with the spies is that when they came, they didn't just say what they observed, but they also drew a conclusion. And they drew a conclusion which was the lack of faith. And that was a problem. Yeah, that was a problem. By way of analogy, for those of you that have watched it, there's an address that Prime Minister Eshkol delivered immediately before. It's not to watch. It's really, I guess you could see parts of it on video, but it was on the radio. He delivered it on the radio on the eve of the 6-day war. When the fledgling Jewish nation, right, was only 20 years old at the time, was surrounded by lots of Arab nations that wanted to destroy it, right? This is famous history. If you don't know this history, I encourage you to join us for the upcoming course, which we're having starting at the end of July, Survival of a Nation, which is going to go through the whole history of the land of Israel and the importance of the land of Israel. And we're going to go through lots of different things that way. We're also going to talk about some more nuanced details like the morality of preemptive strikes or the land for peace talks that there always are, and whether those are supported by a Jewish approach or not. Either way, but on the eve of the 6-day war, Prime Minister Eshkol delivers an address which is fascinating to listen to, because apparently something happened right before. Either he lost his papers or somebody switched out the speech. I forget the exact details. When you hear the speech, you hear him stuttering and stammering over his words and can't get his words out straight. And apparently, what they say is, the people on the ground, is that the effect that it had on the people was the exact opposite of the effect intended. In other words, he thought he'll get on, he'll arouse the troops, he'll make everybody, give a positive. And instead, they felt in him fear, and that instilled in everybody fear. Now, they won the war, of course, miraculously. But the morale of the troops at the beginning of the war was very, very low. So this was the issue with the spies, that they delivered their information skewed by their lack of faith, presenting it in a way that we'll never be able to conquer the land. In Hebrew, as we said, this is called Lashon Hara, which means evil speech. We're not allowed to talk negatively about another person. And in this case, we're not allowed to talk negatively about a situation. Okay? Now, Rashi points out something very interesting. At the end of last week's parasha, right? Remember, this episode that we've just been discussing till now is the beginning of this week's Torah portion. At the end of last week's Torah portion, we discussed a story about Miriam. Miriam was also accused of speaking Lashon Hara, speaking negative speech. In her instance, it was about Moses. She was talking to Aaron, saying, why did Moses have to divorce his wife and support her through all that pain, when really, we are also prophets and prophetesses, right? We also speak to God, and we don't have to do that. Why does Moses have to? Now, without getting into why they were wrong, the very fact that Miriam was able to speak this way about Moshe Rabbeinu, even though all the facts were true, again, this is not to do with whether it's true or not. That would be falsehood versus truth. Here it's to do with the way she spoke, the attitude with which she spoke. That's why she was plagued with leprosy, as we learned about in last week's parasha. But Rashi points out something very interesting about the juxtaposition between the two. Text 3. Hold on, this is, the spies used the power of their words to manipulate facts, turning the people away from God. The story follows the incident where Miriam is punished for slander as well. So in text 3, we see that story. Where are we here? Stephanie, can you read for us, please?
Yes. It says, send yourself men. Why is the section dealing with the spies juxtaposed with the section dealing with Miriam? Because she was punished over matters of slander for speaking against her brother. And these wicked people witnessed it, but did not learn their lesson.
So says Rashi, do you know why these two stories come one after the other? Because they're really similar in nature. They actually happen chronologically close to each other. Miriam spoke slanderously about Moshe Rabbeinu, and she had repercussions to that. And the spies observed what happened. By the way, this was a pretty famous story because as a result of Miriam's righteousness, the entire camp of Israel waited for her for 7 days, I believe it was in total, until she was healed, and while she was outside the camp, etc., until they continued to travel. Instead of her falling behind and then needing to catch up, or whatever other way that it would work, the entire nation waited for her. So this wasn't like a small, side off the sideline story. This was a well-documented story. And the spies saw this story, but they did not take heed. They didn't take it to heart. And that's where the two stories are juxtaposed one to the other. Okay? Now the Rebbe points out something very interesting about this juxtaposition. Kalman, can I ask you to read for us, please, text 4?
When we read these two passages, one after the other, the story of Miriam and the story of the spies, both of which are about Lashon Hara, one could possibly make the terrible mistake of thinking that Miriam and the spies can be placed in the same category, God forbid, or at least that the two stories are similar to one another. Seemingly, to avoid such a misunderstanding and to make clear that the spies were not on Miriam's spiritual level at all, the Torah ought to have placed these two stories apart from one another and placed some other passage in between them.
Says the Rebbe, really? You're going to compare these two stories? Hold on a second. Let's just clarify here something for a second. Miriam may have technically spoken Lashon Hara about Moshe Rabbeinu, right? But this doesn't take away, and obviously she shouldn't have, and that was the wrong thing to do. This doesn't take away from her righteousness as a woman, right? Like we said, even when she was punished, the whole crowd waited for her because of her righteousness. She was a prophetess, and she has so many amazing stories besides. So the Torah chooses to put the two together, right? Meaning contrasted versus the other one, which the Torah is kind of lumping together, at least by Rashi's interpretation. These spies had truly wrong intentions. They wantonly reported negatively about the land. Their intention was to speak Lashon Hara about the land. You're going to compare the two together? I mean, one of them results in her with her little, punishment and her little almost slap on the wrist, and that's it. And the other one results in 40 years. So if we're judging based on the reaction, right, the other one results in nobody entering the land of Israel, a rebellion by the Jewish people, all of the spies dying, and 40 years of hanging out in the desert until they can enter the land of Israel. Right? Even if you just base the comparison on the results, clearly something's askew here. So here's really the question I'm asking. Hold on a second. You want to put the two together and compare the two. Sorry, Ali, I'm going to mute you. There you go. Okay, thank you. Because we got some feedback when you have both of them on. Says the Rebbe, how can you put the two of them together? And even though the Torah doesn't say it, and even though Rashi doesn't say it, but they're implying that their issue was of similar stature. That's huge. Like you can't do that. And then the Rebbe points out something very, very fascinating. Someone could say, all right, we're not comparing the two, but we're saying that they should have learned a lesson from her. We're not saying that they're both just as evil, or they both did equally terrible things. No, we're just pointing out that they should have learned a lesson from her. Says the Rebbe, but by the very fact that the Torah puts them together, there's another issue at hand here. There is a verse in the Torah which says, "V'hiyisem nikim mehashem u'miyisrael," that you should be clean from God and from fellow Jews. From this we learn that you're never, that in addition to us not doing immoral things or not doing negative things, we also shouldn't do things that look negative or look bad. That give off the impression that we're doing something negative. Ali's asking, did everyone know why Miriam got punished? I don't know. I don't know if everyone knew.
Okay, I didn't know if it was something like everybody knew that she spoke about him.
Everybody knew she had tzarat, and everybody knew that tzarat comes for lashon hara, and I think that was pretty famous at the time. Whether they knew that it was for speaking of Moshe Rabbeinu and what exactly was it she spoke, I don't know.
Got it. Okay, sorry to interrupt. I was just curious.
Anyway, that was last week's parsha, so I get to say I know all the answers. I just don't want to discuss it because no kidding, I don't know the answer. But let's take a look at the Rambam, the way he describes, and Ali, since you're sitting now, if you can read for us, please, the Rambam, which describes this concept. Okay, this is a very powerful lesson, by the way. Even if the lesson at the end of the class is for some reason is not going to resonate with you, this is a very powerful lesson. We don't just avoid doing negative things; we also avoid negative impressions. Right? You ever hear somebody say, "I'm going to do whatever I want, and I'm going to make sure that I'm doing the right thing. Whatever everybody else thinks about me, I don't care." No, you also have to make sure that people don't have the wrong impression about you. Let's see. Go ahead, Ali. You with us? I don't know if she is. Meanwhile, we'll do Catherine. Catherine, are you here with us?
Yes, okay.
So I'm going to ask you to read for us text 5, which is the Rambam, Maimonides, who's describing an interesting law with regards to the charity that was given, kind of the collections that there were, the donations that there were in the Holy Temple. So Catherine, when you're ready, text 5, please.
In 3 baskets, they make the appropriation for shekels from the chamber, and on them was inscribed Aleph, Bet, Gimel. Rabbi Ishmael says Greek was inscribed on them, Alpha, Beta, Gamma. The one who made the appropriation did not enter the chamber wearing either a bordered cloak, or shoes, or sandals, or tefillin, or
Amulet.
Lest he became poor, and people might say that he became poor because of sin committed in the chamber. Or if he became rich, people might say that he became rich from misappropriation in the chamber. For it is one's duty to seem free of blame before others, as before God, as it is stated, and you shall be guiltless before God and before Israel. And it states further, and you will find favor and a good understanding in the eyes of God and man.
Thank you. I mistakenly set up this quote as if it's from the Rambam. It's actually not from the Rambam, it's from the Mishnah. And it's from the Mishnah and tractate Shekalim, which talks about all the donations that were given in the Holy Temple, right? And the discussion there is that they were super careful, but whoever went into this chamber where the donations were stored, right? In those days, they didn't have CCTVs, and CC security cameras and that kind of thing, right? So they had to be sure that things were going to be done straight and honest. So the person who would go in, with the bare minimum of clothing on him, it says. No pockets, no tefillin that he could stuff stuff into, no amulets, which is like a parchment or a scroll that he would hold, that they would hang around their necks for protection, that they could stuff something into, nothing. He wouldn't take anything in with him like that. Nobody should be able to say he stole and he took some, and that's why he's so rich, because he took money from there, or maybe that's why he's so poor, because he stole and now now he was punished as a result. So in other words, we take great precautions to make sure not only that we don't speak negatively about other people, but that we don't even say something which could be interpreted negatively about other people. So now back to our parsha. Boom, bada boom. Miriam's sin was so minor, and then the Torah comes and puts them side by side, juxtaposes her sin and the spy's sin, and the spy's sin. Why is she being compared to the much greater sin of the spies? Right? And as we said, the temple protocols were put in place to create transparency in the first place, to avoid appearance of wrongdoing. So wouldn't the Torah intentionally make sure to put something between the two of them? Because they're so easily mixed up, Because they look so similar, wouldn't you think the Torah would put something in between to make sure that we shouldn't compare them? This, by the way, is not uncommon practice. If you go back to last week's Parsha, there's this interesting thing, and for those of you that were in shul last week on Shabbat, you know that when we did Hagba, Rabbi Pinson announced it. I highly doubt anybody was able to see it, but he announced that you could look for it. Last week's Parsha is the only time when there are other symbols in the Torah besides for Hebrew letters. There are two, well, they are Hebrew letters, but they're backwards. There are two backwards nuns in the Torah last week. Yep. And that's at the beginning and end of one section, the section of Vayehi ben Aaron, and it's particularly to point out that that section doesn't really belong there. It's just put there in order to separate between two things that are going on. Very fascinating. Two nuns, the letter nun, right? Just backwards.
Huh. Because it's not supposed to be there, but isn't everything there for a reason?
No, of course it's supposed to be there.
What'd you say? That it doesn't, you said it doesn't belong, what'd you say?
No. That section of the Torah,
yeah,
happened chronologically the way that it is there. It's the section of the Torah which is Vayehi ben Aaron, the same words that we say when we open the Holy Ark, that section of the Torah happened chronologically elsewhere. It's just stuck in there in order to divide between two negative things. What I'm pointing out is that sometimes the order of the Torah is specifically set up so that you don't learn the wrong lesson from it. So wouldn't you think that something should be put here in between the story of Miriam and the story of the spies, which seems so similar because they're both Lashon Hara, but really are very different, because hers was a small grievance and the spies was tremendous. So why is there no difference between them? Why is there nothing in between them?
Did they get Sarat also?
They died. A little more intense than Sarat. They all died. Well, not all. 10 out of 12, because Yoshua and Kalev didn't. And the Jewish people was decreed upon the Jewish people as a result of their act that the Jewish people didn't go into the land of Israel for 40 years.
Oh, right.
It's a pretty intense, offense here we're talking about. Okay, everybody with me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's leave this question aside now for a moment. I'm going to spend like 10, 15 minutes now discussing the topic of tonight's class, which is, as we set it up at the beginning, sacrificing spirituality for someone else's spirituality. And then we'll come back and we'll see if we can't learn something from this week's parsha to inform that. Okay? So we have ourselves now one big, powerful question. Why would the Torah choose to juxtapose Miriam's grievance with the spies' grievance when really they seem to be on two totally different levels? Okay? Lending credibility to someone who might think that they are equal in their offense. Okay. As a reminder, the question on the table is, when we have a situation in which there is someone else that we can help spiritually, but in order for us to help them, we have to put aside some of our own spirituality. We have to compromise on our spirituality. Okay? So as it turns out, this is discussed at length in the Gemara, in the Talmud, and we're going to bring two instances where we're going to see, as you'll see in just a moment, two vastly different approaches as to what to do in such a circumstance. Okay? The first instance is what we'll call case number one, the dough in the oven. Okay? The Talmud in Tractate Shabbat deals with a situation in which somebody put a loaf of bread or a pile of dough, which is going to be a loaf of bread, into an oven on Shabbat. Now, if you're not familiar with the laws of Shabbat, this is not just like an offshoot of a melacha. This is 100% forbidden. Okay, of the 39 prohibited laws of Shabbat, prohibited forms of work on Shabbat, one of them is baking. So to put something into an oven and for it and the oven to be on and it's going to bake, this was totally 100% forbidden. And if a person would do that, they would actually be put to death. That's how, if they did it intentionally and if there were witnesses, etc. So a man went and put dough into the oven. Okay. Now, before we keep moving, the oven was a specialized oven that, to the best of my knowledge, this form of baking doesn't exist today. But in the times of the Talmud, they would bake by taking the dough and sticking it to the side of the oven. Interesting. I never heard of this concept before. Or maybe to the floor of the oven. There was no pan. There was no nothing. And then there was this interesting process where after it was baked, there was a special process that they would use to detach it from the side of the oven. And this was called lirdois esapas, okay? To detach the bread from the side of the oven.
I've seen it done over there.
You have seen it done?
Yes, they just throw it right up against the wall of the oven.
Arnold, you were alive at the times of the Talmud?
Oh, thank you very much. No, in 2014, when I was there. And
Where? Israel? Where?
In Jerusalem. I saw it done in Jerusalem.
Okay, interesting. I've never seen such a thing done. Okay.
Yeah.
So the rabbi said, listen, we are going to put a prohibition, not just, technically the Torah only tells you you're not allowed to bake, but in order to avoid you from even getting close to it, so the rabbi said we're going to make it prohibited even to remove the bread off the side of the wall, which technically, according to the Torah, might be allowed in a situation where it was fully baked, and whatever, it might technically be allowed. But the rabbi said it's too close to baking. So we're going to say, avoid doing that. As we know, the rabbis are always setting boundaries for us a little bit further than the Torah in order that we shouldn't get to coming to going against the prohibition.
Right.
The Talmud in Tractate Shabbat says something very interesting. If a man wantonly goes and puts a slab of dough into the oven, so now he has desecrated Shabbat, right? No, he hasn't desecrated Shabbat yet. He put it into the oven, and as soon as it finishes baking, then he will have desecrated Shabbat because he will have baked on Shabbat. Okay? And 3 minutes later, or 10 seconds later, he does teshuvah. And he said, he regrets what he did, and he says, "What have I done?" Now he still has a chance to make it up, right? He's going to make sure it doesn't bake. The problem is that the rabbis prohibit him from now removing the dough from the oven. So says the Talmud, a Jew is allowed to commit this minor offense in order to avoid doing a greater offense.
Bigger one.
Pretty straightforward and logical, right? Everybody with me so far?
Yeah.
Now let's make it complicated. What about somebody else? Let's say it was Reuven, who was the Rasha. He's the one who did something terrible and threw the dough into the oven on Shabbat. And Reuven leaves. And maybe Reuven still wants it to bake. Maybe he even made a whole show out of telling everybody that I'm going to desecrate Shabbat. But Shimon is there 2 minutes after Reuven left. And Shimon, nice God-fearing Jew, has the ability to take the dough out and to save Reuven from from desecrating Shabbat, just by removing the dough. The problem is that by so doing, Shimon will be desecrating Shabbat, at least rabbinically, a smaller offense, in order to save Reuven from a greater offense. So, in other words, he's a very kind fellow. He's willing to, and we're trying to figure out if this is the right thing to do, he's willing to give up a little bit of his own spirituality to commit a minor offense against Shabbat, a minor desecration of Shabbat, in order to avoid a greater offense on his friend's behalf. Is he allowed to do it? Believe it or not, the Talmud discusses it, and this is text 6 of our text. Okay, I had to set that up because I didn't want to read too much of the text of the whole Talmud here. So Phil, if you can read for us, please.
Shelach said that they permitted someone else to remove the bread to save the individual from transgression. Parshat strongly objected to this. Do we tell a person sins that another will benefit? Rather, as Rav Peter Abayai said, if one stuck bread to the oven, rabbis permitted him, but not someone else, to remove it, avoiding a more serious transgression that would incur the death penalty.
Says the Gemara, and this rhetorical question, it says Rav Sheshet, and this rhetorical question became one of the most famous statements in the Gemara, quoted all over the Talmud and in rabbinic literature. V'chi omrim lo la'adam chato kedei sheyiske chavercha? Do we tell a person to sin so that another person will benefit? Doesn't work that way. You are allowed to do it for yourself. But for someone else to do it for a sinner, the sinner himself is allowed to do it. But for someone else to do it on behalf of the sinner, that you're not allowed to do. Everybody with me?
No, my screen froze. You can't do it for somebody else, only for yourself.
We're not allowed to do it for someone else. Not only that, we get this famous rhetorical question that the Talmud says, do we tell a person to sin so that another will benefit? It doesn't make one bit of sense. Why should one person commit a sin in order to benefit another person? Which seems to be implying, back to our original question, that it would seem that you do not compromise on your own spirituality. This question is very close to home, by the way, for Chabadniks. You do not compromise on your own spirituality in order to save another person spiritually. Okay? That's what it seems, at least from this Talmudic section. All right.
But it's okay for the individual who initiated.
That's for sure. A person on his own is allowed to commit a minor offense in order to stop himself from committing a greater offense. For sure. Okay. That's to the person themselves.
Yeah.
Okay. Case number 2. Everybody ready? And this one is going to have the exact opposite conclusion, and we're going to try to figure out what's going on here. Case number 2 is the case of the unconventional tithe. Okay? I believe everybody's familiar with what tithing is, but just in case you're not, there are lots of agricultural laws in the land of Israel. And as I always like to joke, in America, if you're on vacation somewhere and there's no kosher markets and no kosher restaurants around, and not even a Ralph's with a kosher section or something, so then your best bet is to walk into the store and pick up some fruits and vegetables, because that's always kosher, right? Best to be on the safe side. You can make sure it's not cut, but even if it's pre-cut, it's probably good too, right? But if you're in the land of Israel, or as I like to say, this is the one case in which the BDS movement and the religious Jews agree that if you walk into Trader Joe's and you see peppers, which has happened to me before, and you see peppers and there's a little sticker on it that says imported from Israel, you got yourself a problem on your hands. Why? Because you don't know. Now, I was totally joking when I said the BDS and religious Jews agree on this matter. They totally don't. I actually once had this opportunity. I was in Trader Joe's here on Lake Avenue. There were peppers that were imported from Israel. And I bought them, and I found out exactly what the laws were, and I had to take off a little piece and wrap it and put it in the trash, a whole story. But I refused to not buy produce from Israel just because I had a doubt about whether they were kosher or not. But either way, my point is, when you come to the land of Israel, everything gets turned on its head. Usually you can go to the store and buy products, lots of products with kosher symbols on them. The fruits and vegetables are a little iffy. You got to make sure it's from the right place. It's got to have a hechsher. It's got to have a kosher symbol. You got to make sure it's kosher. Why is that? That's because there are lots of agricultural laws in the land of Israel that we need to make sure are followed. One of those is tithing, which means to take 10% of the produce and give it to poor people. That's an oversimplification of it, but let's just leave it at that. Okay. Now, in the times that now, so if you walk into any market, and you just walk over to some random person that you don't know, and you want to buy fruits and vegetables from him, you have to verify, and there has to maybe be a rabbinic approval that tithing was done from these fruits and vegetables. If not, either you have to do it, or you're not allowed to buy it from him, depending on the circumstance. Okay? There is one exception to this Talmudic rule, and that is the times of the Talmud there were learned fellows, Talmidei Chachamim, what the Talmud calls a chaver. Okay, a chaver means someone that is well versed in Talmudic law, and so you can assume, you walk over to a God-fearing Jew, presumably if he's selling you fruits and vegetables, or if he's giving you fruits and vegetables, presumably he already tithed them. Otherwise, he wouldn't even be handling them, right? Now, according to Jewish law, you have to tithe from the same fruits and vegetables that you are eating. Okay, so let's say you have one field or one tree gives you lots of apples, or one field of wheat gives you lots of wheat. You have to tithe and take 10% of that wheat and put it aside. Okay, so the Gemara poses the following question: what if a chaver, which means a rabbi, let's say, for lack of better translation, sends his workers, okay, clearly not learned fellows, to the orchard to collect some fruit, and he then sells them on the market? Can we assume that the fruit have already been tithed or not? Okay? Now, the fruit have not been tithed by the learned fellow. We know we cannot assume that his workers tithed them. So says the Talmud, if you are buying from the chaver, you can assume that he tithed, even if it's impossible that he tithed. What's the loophole? How would it have worked? We say probably he tithed in a way that's actually not allowed, but at least tithing was done. What does this mean? You're not supposed to, but you could technically tithe from other fruits, not the fruits that he's selling you. It says the Talmud, you can assume that he did that in a non-proper way in order to make sure that he's selling you fruits that have already been tithed from. It's not your problem, it's his problem. In this instance, even if you didn't understand all the details, that's fine. But in this instance, the chaver is sacrificing some of his spiritual status, some of his spirituality, in order to make sure that another Jew is not eating fruit or vegetables, produce that hasn't been tithed. Let's see in text 7 how this is described by the Talmud. Where are we here? I guess we're back up at the top. Arnold, if you can read for us, please, text 7. You're muted.
You're dead.
Arnold, you're muted.
Arnold, stop.
Arnold.
It is.
There
we
you
go.
Got it.
again.
Sorry for that.
You got it.
Rabbi reasoned it is preferable for the haver to commit a minor offense, separating tithes in the wrong fashion, so that another person not unwittingly commit a graver offense, eating untithed produce.
Says Rabbi, we can assume about this chaver that he did something wrong, that he committed a minor offense in order that another person shouldn't commit a graver offense. Very interesting.
Why wouldn't you just tithe it properly? I don't understand.
That's a good question. Let's leave that aside for now, okay? Because we're here to take the deeper part here, which is the logic here. The logic is that we say, in this instance, it seems clear that you are allowed to to commit a minor offense in order to save someone else from doing a graver offense. So how do we figure out what the right approach is? Right. If you're in a situation where you have the ability to compromise on a minor halacha, on some minor spirituality on your case, in order to save another Jew from doing something worse, if we take the case number 1 of the dough in the oven, right? It's the rhetorical question became famous. Should one person sin in order to benefit another? Seemingly not. But if we take our cue from this instance, then it seems exactly the opposite. The unconventional tithe, here it seems that not only can we assume that it was done, but we can assume that the chaver did it even in a situation where he's committing a minor offense, so that he stops someone else from doing a graver offense. In Talmudic terminology, we are now at what we call a stira. Raise your hand. Anybody ever experienced a stira before? A stira is a Talmudic contradiction, where there's two clear contradictions. Two things clearly contradict each other. Now, you all are sitting here and you process this beautifully, very nice. I get it. Yep, that seems very clear. You have to understand that there was a time when not only did Zoom not exist, but being able to quote the Talmud from an online text didn't exist. Not only that, most people didn't even have the whole Talmud in front of them. So what I just quoted for you was 2 sections of the Talmud that are, as removed from each other as they can get. One of them appears in tractate Shabbat, in the middle of the laws of Shabbat. The other one appears in tractate Eruvin, and it's not even on topic with Eruvin, it's off topic, and it's talking about tithing. So in order to even find this contradiction, you had to be like such a well-versed scholar. You have to not only know some Talmud, not only have to learn through the entire Talmud, but know most of the Talmud off by heart. Okay? This type of study, in other words, juxtaposing something that it says in one part of the Talmud versus something it says in a completely different part of the Talmud that seem contradictory, and trying to figure out how do we make this work, this mode of study is reserved, for the most part, to a group of people called the Tosophists. You may have heard of them before. If you open up any page of Talmud, on one side you have Rashi. Rashi, for the most part, does not get involved in this type of analytical behavior. Rashi is here to help you through a page of Talmud, and if you don't have some background information, Rashi will give you the background information. If you don't understand something, Rashi will explain it to you. Tosafot says, we assume you understand everything, because you had Rashi to do that. But now, if you're ready for it, you learned this and you thought you understood it perfectly. Clearly, you didn't understand it well enough if it contradicts something 3 tractates ago. So we have to figure out how to make these two work, and that sometimes leads us to a much deeper understanding of the topic. Now, we here, 21st century Jews, have the benefit of sitting in our air-conditioned homes and with our beautiful screens in front of us, and the Talmud comes up as soon as Rabbi Zoshi presses the button. The Talmud comes up in front of us, and we can sit and sip wine while we do it. So we're going to take the easy route, but you're still going to need to use your brain a little bit. Okay, so here we go.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
I mean, the Gemara in Shabbos and the Gemara in Eruvin, it's wonderful and it's great. But why do we have to go to such extremes to figure out cases of when somebody wants to sacrifice their own spirituality? If I want to give my esrog to somebody else, I'm sacrificing my spirituality. Or I'll give you another example that's closer to home. If you're a Talmud Chacham or a rabbi and you're a Shliach, you're giving up from your own learning and spirituality to go to a city to help others, to sacrifice your own ruchnias. So, I mean, that's a question. But why do you need the Gemara in Shabbos as an example?
You have to find a source for it in the Torah. The Torah, meaning we can't just choose. The way you're describing it sounds like you're saying it should obviously be yes. If you choose to do that, you could do that. But it's you giving up your own spirituality. The question is, what gives you the right to do that? If you're not allowed to, according to halacha, then it's nice that you want to do that, but you shouldn't be doing that. The question is, what is the proper mode of conduct that Hashem wants us to do in this instance? Mm-hmm. And it's not necessarily obvious that we just follow what halacha wants. In certain instances, we might need a compromise on halacha. By the way, certainly not compromise on something big. We're talking here about compromising on maybe your own stringencies or compromising on your own. In all of these instances in the Talmud, by the way, nobody is going against the Torah, right? Either they're transgressing a rabbinical edict, or that was the case of the dough on the side of the oven, or they're not tithing in the best way possible, which ideally you shouldn't tithe that way, but everything is still getting done. But the reason they're choosing to do it less than is in order to, right? They're not actually going against the Torah. They're just compromising a little bit on it in order to affect somebody else. They're compromising on their spiritual gain for someone else's spiritual gain, or avoiding someone else's spiritual loss. And that's the question. Is that something, is that proper for a Jew or not? What was that?
But they're losing too. It's not just that the
They're
other one's
losing out.
gaining, they're losing.
The question is whether they're allowed to.
I mean, but we're allowed to, I think what Colin's saying, like, is we're allowed to break halacha if we want, or we're allowed to, right? Don't we have free will? Is that, I think that. Of course
we can, but this is talking about somebody who wants to do the right thing. He's presented with this scenario, and what's the right thing for me to do? It's impossible for us both to keep the Torah fully, to every single detail, with every nuance and every stringency. One of us is going to lose out. The question is, am I allowed to let go of mine in order to help someone else?
Okay.
Without even knowing the answer, I would say clearly yes, without even thinking about it. I mean, that's what Kol Yisrael Arevim is. I mean,
we're going to touch on Arvus. We're going to get there. Kol Yisrael Arevim actually gets much, much deeper. We're going to talk about that in a moment. So we are going to answer this question actually in two ways. Tosfot provides two resolutions to this conflict. Again, if you're not with us, let me summarize it for you very briefly, and then you can join us. Okay? The question on the table is as follows. There are two instances in the Talmud. One instance seems to imply that a Jew should give up of his own spirituality in order to help another Jew. And one instance seems to apply it's not your right to let go of your own spirituality in order to help someone else. Okay. The first answer in Tosafot comes to us from, we actually don't know who. It's given to us without a name. The second one is the Riva. Okay, but let's start with resolution number one. Okay, resolution number one is gonna create a difference between the two scenarios. That in one of them he was negligent, in the other one there's vigilance. Okay, where are we holding here? Arnold just read for us. So I think Phil, if you can read for us, please. Hold on, this is still summarizing. So text 8 for us, please. Go ahead.
We can explain that the rule, doing cause someone to commit a sin in order, and the not only applies when that fellow acted negligently.
So says Tosfot, perhaps in the story with the dough, when the Gemara chooses this extreme statement, this rhetoric where we say, do we tell someone else to sin in order to benefit someone else? Maybe that logic only applies when the person did something negligently wrong. They purposely went, in this instance, obviously, Reuben went and stuck the dough inside in the oven on purpose, right? He went against the Torah, right? In that instance, no. You can't choose to do that. But in a situation like by the chaver, where it wasn't done purposely, the person bought the produce, and this whole story happened. So then you're allowed to go. And in fact, not only is the person going to be doing it unknowingly, but possibly it hasn't even, right? Possibly he doesn't even know the laws of tithing, the person who bought it. And in this instance, you have an ability to even though he doesn't know about it, to just save him from going against the Torah. In that instance, yes, you do compromise on your own in order to do it for somebody else. Okay? Just to show you how far-reaching these instances go, let's fast forward a little bit to the Rashba. Okay, so the Rashba, I'm sorry, not the Rashba, to the Beis Yosef. We're in the Rashba soon. No. This case was presented to the Rashba. We're going to quote now from the Beis Yosef, but the Rashba, a very famous rabbi, Rabbi Shlomo or Shimon ben Aderet, I forget his name. In any event, he had a situation where someone's daughter was kidnapped. Okay, now this is going to sound awfully similar to today when people are fighting over custody or extradition and this kind of thing. A guy came and ran off with someone's daughter. Okay, the guy happens to have been Jewish, but he wasn't a very religious Jew, and he was actually a rebellious Jew. And he ran off with someone's daughter. Of course, the man is going to go run to go get his daughter back, right? The problem is it's Shabbat, and this Jew who doesn't give a rat's you know what about Judaism is running outside of the city, and a Jew would technically not allowed to be able to pursue him. The question is, what should the father do? This question was asked of the Rashba, and the Beit Yosef actually quotes it. Kalman, can you read for us, please? Text 9a.
The Rashba was asked about the case of a man who was informed on Shabbat that his daughter had been forcibly taken from his home by a renegade Jew who intended to lead her away from her faith. Was it permissible to journey beyond the tomb or to procure a seal from the government? Can we override the rules of Shabbat for the possibility of saving?
Like the court orders that they have today, like an extradition. I guess that's what that seal means. Okay, go ahead.
Can we override the rules of Shabbat for the possibility of saving her, as we do for saving a life? He responded that the matter requires further study.
Okay, so the Rashba deferred, and he said, I'm not going to get into this. But the Beit Yosef doesn't. Okay, the Beit Yosef, for those of you who don't know, is Rabbi Yosef Kairo, the author of Shulchan Aruch. He actually goes deeper into this, and he actually does answer the question. And let's see what he says. Kalman?
If we differentiate between one who acted negligently and one who didn't, we can conclude as follows. In this case, she was not negligent. Therefore, it is permissible to violate the Shabbat law to save her. And in fact, it is a mitzvah to do so. It would seem that it is permissible even to violate Torah prohibitions. Doing so would be considered a minor infraction when compared to the possibility of her abandoning her faith and never keeping the Shabbat again.
Let me just show you what's going on here. Okay, for those of you that are not familiar, the Talmud is like the beginning of the Common Era. That's when the Talmud is happening. Okay, the Rashba lives hundreds of years later. The Shulchan Aruch is only in the 1400s. Okay, the Beit Yosef lives in the 1400s. So what's going on over here is as follows. The Rashba is presented with this question, and he says, I don't know. But we, in this class, know why he doesn't know. Because he turns to the Talmud, and the Talmud has two conflicting reports, and he's not sure which one to go with. Is it, heaven forbid, to tell somebody to sin to benefit another person? Or is it better to do a minor infraction and save someone else from doing a greater infraction? Remember, in this instance, he's just going to be desecrating Shabbat one time, one small thing of Shabbat, not to make light of Shabbat, right? But in order to save her from possibly not being Jewish her entire life, not keeping Yiddishkeit her entire life, right? Because if he could save her from this rebellious Jew who was running off with her, presumably they wouldn't have kept Judaism their entire lives, right? So the question is what to do, and the Rashba wasn't sure. But the Beit Yosef says, you know what? I think based on Tosfot's answer, I hope we're not getting too analytical here, Talmudical here. If we are, just take a break for a second. You'll enjoy the lesson at the end. But the Beit Yosef says, Rabbi Yosef Cairo says, he says, look here. Tosfot suggests that the difference is whether you were negligent or you were not negligent. In this instance, the girl was carried away against her will. So he is allowed to go save her from a situation in which she was put into against her will. Okay.
She was kidnapped, right? You
She was
said she was
kidnapped, yeah, against her will.
Yeah, if my kid's kidnapped, I'm gonna go save my kid.
Hold on, I should clarify something for a second. It wasn't kidnapped. The girl went willingly with him. In other words, he seduced her, or like he ran off with her. And there was
forced. She wasn't forced.
She wasn't forced necessarily physically, but spiritually for sure she was forced. And in this instance, there was no physical harm at play here. And let's just remember, if there's any physical harm to any human being, not just your daughter, Ali, the Kuach Nefesh always pushes off Shabbat if there's physical harm. The whole discussion.
Okay, I think I misunderstood what happened to her.
Exactly. The discussion here is only if there's spirituality is on the line, and you want to put your spirituality on the line for someone else's spirituality. Okay. That's the conversation here.
Sorry.
Okay. But there is another way of differentiating between the two cases. Let's go back to Tosafot. Back to that Tosafot in Tractate Shabbat. Ali, if you can read for us, please, text 10. The Riva, okay, so the Riva is Rabbi Yitzchak ben Asher Halevi, or better known as one of the Tosophists. Hold on. Is text 10 up yet? Not yet. Here we go. Go for it.
Rabbi Yitzchak ben Asher Halevi explained that the two cases are different for the following reason. In the case of the Chaver's tithes, no offense has been committed yet, and it is preferable for one to commit a minor offense than to be involved in his fellow committing a more severe offense. But in this case of removing the bread from the oven before it cooks on Shabbos, the forbidden act, which will automatically result in transgression, has already been done. Therefore, one should not actively perform even a minor offense to prevent that from happening.
Just as a way of framing this possibly better, let's just remember what happens when someone does something negative, when someone transgresses the will of Hashem, right? Tanya explains that one of the ways we're looking at this is that there's like a big cable, a fat cable that connects our neshama with God. Tanya bases this on the verse Ki Yaakov Chevel Nachalato, that the house of Jacob has as its inheritance a cable, a chevel, like a thick rope. And that rope is made up of 613 strands. And whenever a person desecrates or violates one of those mitzvot, that strand gets snipped. Did it technically make that big of a difference to the cable? No. But there's something irreversible that happened here that can only be repaired with teshuvah, as we know, right? Now, without getting into the spiritual side too much, the fact remains that there's a huge difference between before the occurrence of what happened here or after the occurrence. And that, says the Riva, might possibly be the difference between these two instances. In the case where Reuven threw dough into the fire willingly, knowing that he's desecrating Shabbat, the transgression has been committed here already. You cannot save him from having committed the transgression. All you could do is save him maybe from being put to death, because you could save him from actually coming to its fruition. But the transgression was done already. The fact that he, quote unquote, snipped that strand, that was done already. Knowingly or unknowingly, forget that for a second. The fact is, it was done already. In the second instance, remember, this Jew who bought these fruits from the workers or from the Chaver himself, right? They are going to eat it soon. And when they eat it, they're going to be eating untithed food. And that's a problem. Says the Chaver, before they transgress, I can step in here and fix the situation. Like that, they don't do it. But I have to be willing to give up a little bit of my spirituality. So perhaps that is the difference between the two instances. And whenever we can help somebody avoid doing a mitzvah, avoid doing an amera, avoid transgressing a mitzvah, that we will do. But if it's after the fact already, then it's too late. Okay. Two resolutions to these situations. Okay. Now let's go back to Miriam. Okay. Perhaps we can gain some insight into exactly what the Torah is trying to do here, or what Moshe Rabbeinu is trying to do here, with understanding the story of Miriam and the spies. Okay? Let's go through this chronologically. There's a story, and Miriam. Now, before we go through chronologically, let me just clarify something, okay? There are two different opinions about how the Torah was given to us. Most commentary agree that each part of the Torah was written down by Moshe Rabbeinu after the episode happened. In other words, it's not like at Mount Sinai, in the Torah that Moshe received, was written the story of the spies. No. It was written, as the Talmud in Gittin says, Megillah, kind of like little Megillas, little sections, little scrolls, okay? So now, we have to remember that there were thousands of things, millions of occurrences happening at the same time in the desert. Not every one of them went into the Torah. Hashem would come down to Moshe Rabbeinu and say, something just happened. It's time for this to be written down in the Torah. Here are the exact words of how I want you to write it down. And then Moshe Rabbeinu would write it down, okay? So the story of Miriam happens. Moshe Rabbeinu writes it down. Okay, what happens next? Okay, according to the Talmud in Gittin, Moshe Rabbeinu wrote down parts of the Torah as soon as they occurred, and he knew that was going into the Torah. So the next thing that happens is, you may have noticed this at the beginning of the class that we split the text that way. Moshe Rabbeinu sends the spies. That's the next section. Then there were 40 days. Where the spies were scouting out the land of Israel. And during those 40 days, nobody knew how the story with the spies was going to end. Moshe Rabbeinu comes, and he realizes that he is in exactly this situation. What's the situation that he's in? He can compromise, even ever so slightly, by possibly throwing Miriam under the rug, or under the bus, and put the story, the beginning of the story of the spies, which has not yet been concluded, he can put it right after Miriam's story with the hope that somebody will learn the lesson that we just learned how terrible Lashon Hara is. Let's not repeat that. And that's what Moshe Rabbeinu does. He writes down the story not after the fact to juxtapose Miriam throwing her under the bus by putting her next to a terrible story with the spies. In the end, that's how the Torah ended up. But when he wrote it, first of all, that was not the case yet. The end of the story of the spies wasn't the case yet, right? It wasn't a terrible story yet. And more importantly, he was hoping to guide the story to the proper conclusion. Let's see how the Rebbe explains. Text 11. Ron, if you can read for us, please. Text 11. We did this already. Go ahead.
This explains how the Torah, by juxtaposition, these two passages could put Miriam in a position where one might suspect that her deeds were somehow comparable to those of the spies. The spies ought to have taken heed from the story and taken care not to commit their sin to begin with. This is reflected in Rashi's choice of words. They did not learn their lesson. The point of sharing the lesson was to save someone else from sinning and to steer them in the right direction.
And this was totally allowed. Why? Because this is a situation where you're holding before the fact, first of all, right? The Jewish people the spies did not sin yet. And if that's the case, then it's acceptable for Moshe Rabbeinu to compare. Lost you guys. I'm a little, my thing here got a little, hold on a second. It's acceptable for Moshe Rabbeinu to put it in a situation where it may possibly make them look. Sorry, the slide stops. I was going to pull this up, but then okay. It's acceptable for Miriam to be compared to the spies in a situation where it's possible that somebody might equate them for the purpose of the downgrade was to save the spies who haven't yet sinned. In other words, the purpose of possibly putting Miriam in a bad light was in a situation where it may have prevented the spies who A, had not yet sinned, and therefore B, may have had a different result and may have come back, instead of speaking Lashon Hara about the land, actually giving a proper report. Now, the lesson here for us. One second, before we get to the lesson. So now the question becomes, what is the logic here? What is the rational basis for this? How could you go into that? So the Shiloh to Tshuvat Even HaEzer, the Shiloh to Tshuvat Ein Yitzchak in Even HaEzer actually points out something very, very interesting that's going on over here. I'm not sure where we're holding here. So Ali, if I can just ask you to read. Text 14.
Inasmuch as one Jew bears responsibility for another Jew, including the one committing sin, this wouldn't be considered sinning to save your fellow, but sinning to save yourself.
This is a very interesting perspective. Kalman mentioned at the beginning of the class that there is something called Kol Yisrael Arevim Ze Lezeh, which means every single Jew is responsible for each other. This is not just something that means that if another Jew is sinning, I have a responsibility to tell him what you're doing is wrong. No. This goes much deeper than that. What's going on here is a Jew has a responsibility because another Jew is one part of the same whole. The Alter Rebbe explains in Tanya that the real proper way to have love for a fellow Jew is to recognize that we are all really part of one whole. There's the famous story with the boat, right? And they find somebody drilling a hole in the boat. He says, I'm not drilling up a hole in anybody else's part. This is the part of the boat that I paid for. This is my cabin, and I'm drilling a hole. Why does that affect anybody else, right? That's the way Jews live, and that's the way Jews treat our responsibility for each other. When someone else is at risk and we can prevent them from going down the wrong path, personal spiritual sacrifice is warranted, not only because it's for us, because the reality is that when we help them, we are helping ourselves. When we stop somebody else from drilling a hole in their part of the boat, we're stopping them from drilling a hole in our part of the boat. And that's the rationale behind why it's allowed to let go of your own spirituality for somebody else. Before we get to like the final kick-in, I want to share a story. There was a chassid whose name was Rabbi Mendoz, and he lived in the former Soviet Union, and then eventually he immigrated, and he lived in Kfar Chabad in Israel, and he lived in London. Either way, without getting into all the details. Rabbi Mendoz was very, very well respected. And one day he finds himself at a Farbrengen or at a Malava Malka at some sort of meal where there's a lot of Hasidim. And the home which was hosting wasn't exactly, it was kosher for sure, but it wasn't up to his standards. I don't know what that means, but something there wasn't the best. Every stringency of kosher, of the laws of kosher, it wasn't up to par with the way he would have kept it. As was it not up to the par of many of the Hasidim there. So Rabbi Mendoz Futterfast chooses not to eat. So he's sitting there, he's not eating. And everybody else is sitting there, nobody's eating. And the host was a well-to-do fellow, and he had put out quite a spread. And there's all this spread on the table, and nobody's eating. All of a sudden, about halfway through the gathering, Rabbi Mendoz takes a plate, starts to pile on, and he starts to eat. So everybody else sees Rabbi Mendoz eating, so they say, oh, he must know something we don't know. It must be, if Rabbi Mendoz could eat it, certainly we can eat it. Before you know it, everybody's eating, the food went, it was delicious, and the gathering is over. They leave the gathering, and the Hasidim all gather around Rabbi Mendoz, and they say, what did you know? I thought we knew that whatever it was, I don't know, maybe the food wasn't Chalav Yisrael, or whatever it was. So Rabbi Mendoz said, I'll tell you. I was sitting and looking around, and I noticed that not a single other person was eating. He says, and I made a simple calculation. He says, the food was kosher. It was my stringency and what level of kashrut I was keeping. That's what was going on here. He says, I made a simple calculation that it was worth it for me to be a little bit lenient in the mitzvah of kosher, but to be super strict in the mitzvah of Avat Yisrael, of loving your fellow Jew and making sure that the host or hostess doesn't get embarrassed. And I was willing to forego a little bit of my spirituality. I was willing to let go a little bit of my stringency in order to make sure that they should have everything that the mitzvah of Avat Yisrael, that they shouldn't be embarrassed whatsoever. Now, note, I want to point out something very simple out. Rabbi Mendoz could have done this without pointing out that he's being stringent in the mitzvah of Avat Yisrael. He could have just said, I made a decision that they're going to be embarrassed, so therefore I let go of that stringency. But the question becomes, who lets you let go of that stringency? And his answer was very simple. When I make sure that they're not embarrassed, I make sure I'm not embarrassed. I care for that Jew because it's part of Avat Yisrael, because Kol Yisrael, because we're all in this together. And that's why it's allowed for me to let go of my spirituality in order to make sure that they don't get embarrassed. because them getting embarrassed is like me getting embarrassed, because we are all in this together. And that's what the Rebbe ends off with. Let's read this final text. I don't know where we're holding here, but Catherine, if I can ask you to read for us, please, text 15. Catherine, you're muted.
Okay, sorry. The Yata Hara might say, true, I'm able to help others spiritually, but am I obligated to lower myself and put myself in a place of impurity for that? Isn't there a rule that we don't tell a person to sin so that another will benefit? The truth is that this reflects what the Torah is all about. As long as one remains unable to put their needs aside in order to help somebody else, he lacks not only a part of Torah, but the core of what the Torah is all about.
What is the Torah all about? The Torah is all about caring for another. Now, I will point out that the lesson from this class is very, very clear. That we have to care so much about a fellow that we should be willing to go and even relax our own spiritual standards in order to help someone else. However, I want to point something out very, very clearly here. This is a very, very iffy situation. Because very often when we say, oh, I'm relaxing my spiritual standards in order to help somebody else, it's very possible that that's really just coming from the Yetzer Hara. And he just wants you to relax your spiritual standard. So it's not black and white. And we have to be very, very clear. And I want to point out two things that are very, very useful in terms of guiding us and making sure that we're doing this properly and we're not just doing this in order to get out of something in Judaism. We're saying, oh, I'm doing it in order to help somebody else. Number one is, I thought they had them here on the slides. Number one is we have to recognize that there's an emotional feeling always behind what we're doing. Is what we're doing coming out of a place of love for the other person, or is it coming out of a place of laziness on our own end in order to keep Torah and mitzvahs? And that's a very strong distinction to make. Because if it's coming from our own laziness, then even if it is benefiting somebody else, if it's coming from our own laziness, then that's the real reason why we are relaxing our standards. And number two is to always ask someone else. Have a trusted advisor, a mentor, a rabbi, somebody who you can turn to and say, listen, I want to let go of this spiritual standard in order to help somebody else, but I'm not sure if I'm doing this because I truly care about the other person, or if it's because my Yetzer Hara is just leading me astray. And the Rebbe would constantly encourage people to have a mashpia, which means a third party, someone that you can ask that can guide you and make sure that you're doing things properly, and most importantly, somebody who's a third party that's unbiased, that's objective to the situation. But I think the lesson is clear that if I can put my spiritual comfort aside and further God's will by bringing another person closer to Torah, I demonstrate that it's not about me, but about God. When I'm doing so much and it's all about me, it's all about my spirituality, there's a problem there too. That can be selfish. We must always keep our eyes open and never be blinded by our devotions to the plight of another person. As we started off the class by saying, ask not what others can do for me, but ask what I can do for others. L'chaim, l'chaim.